It was a crisp December evening in New York City, and the holiday lights cast a warm glow against the biting wind that howled through the streets. On a bustling corner near Rockefeller Center, amidst the cacophony of honking cabs and hurried footsteps, a small voice rose above the noise. 8-year-old Ella stood on the corner, clutching a tin cup with trembling fingers. Her mustard yellow coat, frayed at the edges, was hardly enough to keep the cold at bay. Her cheeks were pale, with streaks of tears frozen to her face, as she sang a delicate melody that seemed out of place against the urban chaos. Her song, a lullaby that spoke of hope and warmth, drew the attention of passers-by, though few stopped. Most hurried by, some dropping a few coins into her cup without so much as glancing at her. Ella's voice, though faint with exhaustion, carried the raw emotion of someone far older. It was a song she had sung to her grandmother, Margaret, who lay gravely ill in their tiny apartment a few blocks away. They had no money for medication, and Ella's nightly performances were their only hope. Among the stream of commuters was William Ashford, a reclusive millionaire in his late 70s. His tailored coat and polished shoes spoke of wealth and influence, but his expression was distant, almost haunted. William rarely ventured into the public sphere, preferring the quiet solitude of his penthouse. But tonight, as he strolled aimlessly, something stopped him in his tracks. Ella's voice, the melody pierced through the layers of his carefully guarded emotions, striking a chord he hadn't felt in decades. He stood still, letting the words wash over him, his chest tightening. That song, he hadn't heard it in years. It was the very same lullaby his mother had sung to him as a child, a distant memory from a life he had all but buried. The song carried him back to the warm, fire-lit evenings of his childhood in Boston, long before ambition and regret had consumed him. William turned toward the child, his sharp eyes narrowing as he studied her, her fragile frame, her chapped hands, and the desperation in her trembling voice told him more than he cared to admit. The haunting familiarity of her song made him feel as though he were peering into the echoes of his own past. The crowd thinned as people rushed home to their families. Ella paused her song to blow into her numb fingers, her breath visible in the icy air. William stepped closer, his imposing figure casting a shadow over the child. "Where did you learn that song?" he asked, his voice deep but surprisingly gentle. Startled, Ella looked up, her large, piercing blue eyes meeting his. She hesitated before speaking, her voice barely above a whisper. "My grandma taught me," she said, clutching the tin cup as if it were her lifeline. William frowned, a flicker of recognition crossing his face. "What's your name?" he asked. "Ella," she replied, her small voice wavering. "I'm just trying to help my grandma. She's sick, and we don't have money for her medicine." The sincerity in her words hit William harder than he expected. He reached into his pocket and pulled out a crisp $100 bill, placing it in her cup. Ella's eyes widened in shock, but she didn't speak. "You shouldn't be out here in the cold," he said, his voice almost stern. "Where do you live?" Ella hesitated. Her grandmother had warned her about strangers, but something about William felt different. His gaze wasn't unkind, it was searching, almost as though he were looking for answers she couldn't give. "Just a few blocks away," she finally said, pointing vaguely down the street. William nodded, though his thoughts were racing. He lingered for a moment longer, his heart heavy with memories he couldn't suppress. The song, her eyes, even her posture, it all stirred something in him. With a final glance at the child, he turned and walked away. But the image of Ella and the sound of her song stayed with him as he disappeared into the night. Ella watched him go, clutching the bill he had given her as though it were a treasure. She had no idea that her small act of resilience had awakened a sleeping giant in the form of William Ashford, a man who had spent decades running from his past. Ella trudged home that night, clutching the tin cup with its small fortune of coins and the crisp $100 bill folded tightly in her tiny palm. The snow crunched beneath her worn boots, and her breath came out in puffs, mingling with the city's winter chill. The streets grew quieter as she entered her neighborhood, a place where the holiday lights were fewer, dimmer, and less festive. The building she called home was a dilapidated structure, its brick facade crumbling in places and windows, often dark from unpaid electricity bills. The apartment was stiflingly small, a single room divided by makeshift curtains for privacy. Ella's grandmother, Margaret, lay on a faded couch, bundled beneath mismatched blankets. Her once vibrant face had grown pallid, marked by the ravages of illness and years of struggle. Her grey hair framed a face etched with kindness and resilience, though her shallow breaths revealed the toll of her condition. "Grandma," Ella whispered as she slipped through the door, careful not to let in the biting wind. She set the cup on a rickety table and hurried to Margaret's side. "I got enough for medicine, and someone gave me a big bill tonight." Margaret's eyes fluttered open, her frailty evident in the tremble of her hand as she reached for Ella. "You shouldn't be out there so late, darling. It's too cold." "I'm okay," Ella assured her, though the red flush of her chapped cheeks told another story. "He was kind, Grandma. He asked about the song you taught me. I told him it was yours." Margaret's lips curved into a faint smile, though her exhaustion was palpable. That song, a lullaby she had composed decades ago during her days as a music teacher, held special meaning. It had been her anthem of hope during the hardest times, a melody that connected her to memories of a life before poverty had taken its grip. "Did you sing it well, my little bird?" Margaret asked softly. Ella nodded, her heart swelling with a fierce determination. "I'll sing it every night if it means I can get what you need." Margaret's gaze turned distant, her fingers lightly brushing Ella's cheek. "You're so brave, Ella. Too brave for your years. It breaks my heart that this is your childhood." Ella blinked back tears, unwilling to show weakness. "It's okay, Grandma. I don't mind. You've always taken care of me. Now it's my turn." Margaret's health had begun to decline several months ago, though she'd hidden it as long as she could. After Ella's parents died in a car accident 3 years earlier, Margaret had taken on the role of caregiver, doing her best to shield Ella from the harshness of their reality. But now, with the medical bills piling up and her own strength failing, it was Ella who had stepped into the role of protector. The loss of Ella's parents had been devastating. Her father, Margaret's only child, had been the anchor of their small family, and his absence left a void that nothing could fill. Margaret had found solace in raising Ella, pouring her love and wisdom into the girl's upbringing. Despite the struggles, she had taught Ella to find beauty in life's simplest moments: a sunbeam breaking through a window, the sound of rain tapping on the roof, or the power of a song to lift weary hearts. Meanwhile, miles away, William Ashford sat in the dimly lit study of his penthouse, nursing a glass of scotch. The encounter with Ella replayed in his mind, her song reverberating in his memory like a haunting echo. He couldn't shake the image of her bright blue eyes, so full of determination and pain. That melody, the very same lullaby his mother used to sing, dug up memories he had spent decades suppressing. William had built his empire with ruthless efficiency, climbing the ranks of New York's elite through shrewd deals and relentless ambition. Yet, as he sat among the trappings of his success, he couldn't ignore the gnawing sense of emptiness. He was a widower, estranged from his only son, and surrounded by a fortress of wealth that offered little comfort. The lullaby had awakened a deep ache, reminding him of a simpler, long-lost time. He retrieved an old photo album from a drawer. Dusting off the leather cover, flipping through its pages, he stopped at a faded photograph of his mother holding a young William on her lap. Her face was serene, her lips parted as if she were about to hum the very song Ella had sung. William stared at the photo, the whiskey forgotten in his hand. "Margaret Hartwell," he murmured, the name surfacing unbidden. A memory stirred. Margaret, his first love, had sung that same song to him during their courtship in Boston. But their paths had diverged, the weight of his family's expectations driving them apart. Could it be the same Margaret? And if so, how had life brought her to this place of hardship? As William sat there, a mixture of nostalgia and guilt gripping his heart, Ella tucked her grandmother into bed. She kissed Margaret's forehead and whispered, "Good night, Grandma. Tomorrow I'll get the medicine." Margaret drifted off to sleep, unaware of the storm brewing in William's mind. Their lives, once intertwined and then separated by years and circumstances, were now on the cusp of reconnection. The following evening, Ella returned to her usual spot near Rockefeller Center. The temperature had dropped even further, and a light snow dusted the sidewalks. She rubbed her hands together, trying to summon the warmth and courage to begin singing. Tonight's crowd seemed more hurried, their faces hidden behind scarves and hats as they shuffled past without sparing her a glance. But Ella's resolve hadn't wavered. She knew the money she'd earned the previous night had bought a small reprieve, but the medicine for her grandmother was an ongoing necessity. So she began to sing once more, her voice trembling at first, but soon finding its steady, haunting rhythm. The melody floated through the air, a stark contrast to the bustle and noise of the city. As she sang, she felt the presence of someone standing nearby. Ella glanced up briefly, and there he was, the same man from the night before. His tall figure and sharp, tailored coat made him stand out against the crowd. His piercing gaze met hers, and for a moment she faltered in her song. But then he nodded almost imperceptibly, a gesture that seemed to encourage her to continue. William Ashford had spent the entire day restless, his mind plagued by memories and questions. After their brief encounter, he had tried to bury the emotions Ella's song had stirred, but they refused to be silenced. He'd walked the same streets again tonight, hoping to find her. When he heard her voice, the ache in his chest returned. There was something unshakable about her presence, something both familiar and profoundly unsettling. When Ella finished her song, William approached her cautiously, his hands tucked into his coat pockets. "You're very talented," he said, his voice calm but tinged with a sincerity Ella wasn't used to hearing. "Do you sing every night?" Ella nodded, wary but polite. "I have to," she replied simply. "It's the only way to help my grandma." William studied her, his sharp eyes softened by an unfamiliar sense of vulnerability. "How is your grandmother?" he asked, his voice quieter now, as though he already suspected the answer. "She's sick," Ella admitted, her fingers tightening around the tin cup. "The doctors said she needs medicine every week, but it's expensive, so I sing." The straightforwardness of her reply cut through William's usual defenses. He paused, searching for the right words. "I'd like to help," he said at last, "if you'll let me." Ella blinked, uncertainty flashing across her face. She had learned to be cautious of offers like this, no matter how genuine they seemed. Her grandmother had always taught her to rely on herself, to trust her instincts above all else. Still, there was something in the way William spoke, a gentleness that contradicted his imposing appearance. "Why do you want to help?" she asked, her voice hesitant but firm. For a moment, William didn't answer. He was caught off guard by the question, unsure how to explain the strange connection he felt. Finally, he said, "You remind me of someone I used to know. Someone who was very important to me." Ella studied him closely, her young eyes seeming far older than her years. She nodded slightly, as though accepting his words without fully understanding them. "Thank you," she said softly. William reached into his coat pocket and pulled out a neatly folded envelope. "This should cover your grandmother's medicine for a while," he said, handing it to her. "I want to do more, but this is a start." Ella hesitated before taking the envelope. Her small hand brushed against his, and for an instant, William felt a pang of emotion he couldn't quite place. "I'll use it for her," she promised, clutching the envelope to her chest. "Good," William replied, his tone steady despite the tumult of thoughts running through his mind. He took a step back, ready to leave, but then he stopped. "Do you sing that song every night?" he asked. Ella tilted her head, confused by the question. "The lullaby? Yes, it's my grandma's favorite." William's throat tightened. He nodded once and turned away, disappearing into the crowd before Ella could say anything more. As she watched him go, Ella felt a strange mix of relief and curiosity. The man seemed kind, but there was a sadness about him, something that made her wonder why he had stopped to listen, why he had cared at all. She slipped the envelope into her coat pocket and picked up her cup, ready to head home. Meanwhile, William walked briskly through the streets, his mind racing. The lullaby, her eyes, her courage, all of it had struck a chord deeper than he cared to admit. He needed to know more about her grandmother. The thought unsettled him, but he couldn't shake it. Back in the tiny apartment, Margaret stirred when Ella returned. "You're home," she murmured, her voice weak but warm. "I am," Ella replied, kneeling by her side. She pulled out the envelope and showed it to her grandmother. "A kind man gave us this. He wants to help." Margaret's brows furrowed as she took the envelope, her frail hands trembling. She opened it slowly, revealing a stack of bills that made her eyes widen in disbelief. "Who would do such a thing?" she whispered, her voice filled with both gratitude and suspicion. Ella shrugged. "He said I reminded him of someone. I think he's lonely, Grandma." Margaret's grip on the envelope tightened as a flicker of recognition passed through her tired eyes. But she said nothing, choosing instead to hold Ella close. Their small world, for now, was safe. The next evening, Ella hesitated before taking her spot on the street corner. The generous envelope she had received the night before had allowed her to buy the medicine her grandmother needed, along with a few groceries. It was a small triumph, but Ella understood their needs extended far beyond a single good day. She braved the cold once again, clutching her tin cup as she stepped into the flow of hurried pedestrians. She began to sing, her voice clear but subdued. Tonight, fewer people stopped to listen. Some cast her brief, sympathetic glances, but the majority swept past, lost in their own concerns. Ella's resolve remained steady, even as her fingers began to numb in the freezing air. From across the street, William Ashford watched her silently, standing near a lamp-post. He had returned, unable to resist the pull Ella's song seemed to have on him. Her resilience stirred something in him that he hadn't felt in years, a sense of responsibility, a nagging urge to act beyond fleeting gestures. But he was uncertain of how to approach her again without alarming her. As William debated with himself, a group of teenagers turned the corner, laughing loudly and jostling each other. They spotted Ella and her small tin cup, their laughter taking on a sharper, crueler edge. One of the boys pointed at her. "Hey, look at her! Singing for pennies like it's some talent show." Ella kept her head down, focusing on her song. She was used to such taunts, though they stung every time. Another boy stepped closer, his grin widening as he flipped a coin into her cup with exaggerated flair. "There you go, little star. Buy yourself a candy bar." The group burst into laughter, but Ella didn't stop singing. She refused to give them the satisfaction of reacting. However, the taunts escalated. One boy kicked at the cup, spilling its contents onto the icy pavement. Coins scattered in every direction, some rolling into the gutter. Ella stopped mid-song, her voice breaking into silence. She knelt quickly, scrambling to retrieve the coins with shaking hands. Tears threatened to spill, but she blinked them back, determined not to cry in front of them. From his spot across the street, William's hands clenched into fists. Without hesitation, he crossed the road, his imposing figure cutting through the group of teenagers like a storm cloud. His voice was sharp and commanding. "That's enough! Leave her alone!" The boys froze, startled by the sudden appearance of the older man. One of them muttered, "We were just joking, mister. No need to get all serious." "Joking?" William's tone was icy. "What part of humiliating a child do you find funny?" The boy opened his mouth to reply, but William's withering glare silenced him, muttering under their breath. The group dispersed, their bravado melting under his intense gaze. As the boys disappeared, William turned to Ella, who was still on her knees gathering the scattered coins. He crouched beside her, his voice softening. "Are you all right?" Ella nodded, though her movements were stiff, her cheeks flushed with a mix of cold and embarrassment. "I'm fine," she said, avoiding his eyes. "Thank you." William reached out, gently placing a hand on her shoulder. "You shouldn't have to deal with this," he said, his voice heavy with something Ella couldn't quite place. "Regret, perhaps, or guilt." "Here," he added, pulling a small bundle of cash from his pocket. "Take this. Go home for tonight." Ella hesitated, her pride warring with her need. She glanced at him, her blue eyes searching his face. Finally, she accepted the money, tucking it into her coat. "Thank you," she said again, her voice barely audible. "I'll walk you home," William offered, his tone leaving little room for argument. Ella hesitated but then nodded. "Okay," she said softly. The walk was quiet at first, the sound of their footsteps crunching through the snow, the only noise between them. William broke the silence after a few blocks. "You're very brave, you know," he said. "Most people would have given up after what happened tonight." Ella shrugged, glancing up at him. "I have to be brave. My grandma needs me." They reached her apartment building, and Ella paused at the entrance, turning to face him. "You don't have to help me," she said, her voice small but firm. "We'll be okay." William's expression softened. "It's not about having to," he said. "Sometimes we help because it's the right thing to do." Ella nodded, though she didn't fully understand his words. She gave him a shy smile before slipping inside, leaving William standing in the snow. As she disappeared into the building, a glint of light caught William's eye. Near the steps, a photo had fallen from her bag, half buried in the snow. He stooped to pick it up, brushing off the frost. His heart stopped. The photo was of a younger Margaret Hartwell, her warm smile unmistakable. William's breath caught as the memories flooded back. It was her, the woman he had loved and lost over 40 years ago. And now, here was Ella, a connection to a past he had buried but never truly forgotten. William stood frozen on the steps, clutching the photo as the weight of realization settled over him. William stood motionless outside the crumbling apartment building, the photograph clutched tightly in his gloved hand. Margaret's image stared back at him, her radiant smile frozen in time. The years had softened his memories of her, but now they surged back with startling clarity. He recalled the gentle laugh she reserved for private moments, the way her voice carried through a room when she sang that lullaby. He had buried those memories beneath decades of ambition and regret. Yet here they were, unearthed by a chance encounter with a child who bore her unmistakable grace. He glanced up at the building, its dark windows an unsettling contrast to the vibrant woman he once knew. What had happened to Margaret? How had she come to live here? And Ella, was she a granddaughter, a niece? The resemblance was too striking to ignore. His heart raced with the weight of questions he couldn't yet answer. Inside, Ella set down her bag and carefully arranged the small amount of food she'd brought back onto their kitchen counter. The groceries were modest, some canned soup, a loaf of bread, and a carton of milk, but to her, they felt like treasures. She warmed a bowl of soup on the stove, her mind still lingering on the man who had helped her. Something about him unsettled her, not in a frightening way, but in the way he seemed to carry a sadness that mirrored her own. "Ella," Margaret's voice called faintly from the living area. "I'm here, Grandma," Ella replied, hurrying to her side with the soup. Margaret's frailty was even more evident tonight, her hands trembling as she tried to sit up. Ella gently propped her up with pillows and handed her the bowl, watching as Margaret took slow, deliberate sips. "How was your singing tonight?" Margaret asked, her voice soft but laced with concern. "It was fine," Ella replied quickly, not wanting to burden her grandmother with the details of the teenagers or the encounter with William. "A kind man helped me again." Margaret's brow furrowed. "This man, who is he?" Ella hesitated. He didn't say much about himself, but he seemed different, like he understood something about us. Margaret nodded slowly, her gaze drifting. Ella thought she saw a flicker of recognition in her grandmother's eyes, but Margaret said nothing more. Instead, she leaned back into the pillows, exhaustion overtaking her. Meanwhile, William remained outside the building, struggling with indecision. He knew he couldn't leave without seeing Margaret. Not now. Summoning his courage, he approached the entrance and pressed the buzzer for their apartment. The sound echoed through the hallways, startling Ella. She glanced toward the door, her heart skipping. Visitors were rare, and at this hour, it was unheard of. She opened the door cautiously, her small frame just visible through the narrow gap. When she saw William standing there, she hesitated before unlatching the chain. "You followed me?" she asked, her voice equal parts suspicion and curiosity. "I'm sorry," William said, his tone sincere. I needed to speak with your grandmother. May I come in?" Ella glanced back at Margaret, who had drifted into a light doze. She bit her lip, weighing her instincts. "Grandma's very tired," she said carefully. "She's not well." William nodded. "I understand. But it's important." After a moment's hesitation, Ella opened the door wider and motioned him inside. The stark contrast between William's polished appearance and the modest, threadbare surroundings was palpable. He stepped in cautiously, his eyes scanning the room until they landed on Margaret. His breath caught. Though the years had altered her features, there was no mistaking her. Margaret Hartwell, the woman who had once been his entire world, lay before him, frail yet undeniably her. Ella watched him closely, noting the change in his expression. "Do you know her?" she asked, her voice tinged with suspicion. I think I might," William admitted, his gaze never leaving Margaret. He approached her slowly, his footsteps careful on the creaking floorboards. "Margaret," he said softly. At the sound of his voice, Margaret's eyes fluttered open. For a moment, they were clouded with confusion, but then they focused on William. A sharp intake of breath escaped her lips. "William," she whispered, her voice barely audible but heavy with recognition. Ella looked between them, her confusion growing. "Grandma, who is he?" Margaret's frail hand reached for William instinctively, her fingers trembling as they brushed his. "It's been so long," she murmured, her tone a mixture of astonishment and pain. Her eyes glistened with unshed tears. William knelt beside her, his expression uncharacteristically vulnerable. "I didn't know," he said, his voice breaking. "I didn't know you were here like this." Margaret shook her head faintly, her strength waning. "Life takes us on strange paths, doesn't it?" she said. a hint of the humor he remembered slipping into her words. Ella stood frozen, the weight of the moment pressing down on her young shoulders. She didn't fully understand what was unfolding, but it was clear that this man, so strange yet kind, was somehow deeply connected to her grandmother. As the tension in the room settled into a fragile silence, William reached into his pocket and produced the photograph he had found. He held it out to Margaret, his hand shaking. "I think this belongs to you," he said. Margaret's eyes widened as she took the photo. Her fingers lingered on the image, and a small, wistful smile touched her lips. "I never thought I'd see you again," she said quietly, her voice barely above a whisper. Ella watched in silence, realizing that this night had become a turning point, though she couldn't yet grasp what it would mean for any of them. The air in the small apartment was thick with unspoken words. William knelt by Margaret's side, his fingers brushing hers lightly, as if afraid the moment might shatter. Margaret's frail hand trembled as she clutched the photograph, her eyes locked on it, as though it held the essence of a life long past. Ella, standing near the door, watched them with mounting unease. The sight of her grandmother, a woman she had always known as guarded and self-reliant, reaching out to this man unsettled her. Who was he, and why did his presence evoke such emotion in her otherwise reserved grandmother? "Grandma," Ella said hesitantly, breaking the fragile silence. "How do you know him?" Margaret took a deep breath, her chest rising and falling with effort. Her voice, though soft, carried the weight of decades. "William and I, we knew each other when we were young, a lifetime ago." William lowered his gaze, guilt etched into his features. "I left when I shouldn't have," he admitted, his voice barely above a whisper. "I made mistakes I've regretted every day since." Ella took a cautious step forward, her small frame tense. "Why are you here now, after all this time?" William glanced at Margaret, silently seeking permission to speak. Margaret nodded faintly, her expression unreadable. "I didn't know Margaret was here," William said, turning to Ella. "I met you on the street by chance, heard your song, and something about it, about you, felt familiar. It led me here." Ella's brow furrowed, skepticism flickering across her face. "You just happened to find us." "It wasn't just luck," William admitted, his voice tinged with urgency. "Your song, the lullaby, it's one Margaret used to sing. I recognized it immediately. It's what drew me to you." Margaret's lips curved into a faint smile. "That song always was my bridge to the past," she murmured, her voice distant. She looked up at William, her gaze softening. "And now it seems it's brought you back." Ella watched them, her confusion growing. "Grandma," she asked carefully, "why didn't you ever tell me about him?" Margaret hesitated, her fingers tracing the edges of the photograph. "Some memories are too painful to share, Ella," she said quietly. "I didn't want you to carry the weight of my mistakes." The words hung in the air, thick with regret and meaning. Ella's young mind struggled to process the layers of history unraveling before her. She opened her mouth to speak again, but was interrupted by a sharp knock at the door. All three turned toward it, startled. "Are you expecting someone?" William asked, his tone wary. Ella shook her head, moving cautiously toward the door. She peeked through the small crack, recognizing their neighbor, Mrs. Johnson, standing there with a worried expression. Ella opened the door just enough to speak. "Is something wrong, Mrs. Johnson?" The older woman glanced nervously into the apartment. "I heard voices and wanted to check on your grandmother," she said. Her eyes darted to William and her brow furrowed. "Who's this?" Ella hesitated, unsure how to respond. Margaret spoke up, her voice steadier than before. "It's all right, Lila," she said. "He's an old friend." Mrs. Johnson's expression softened, though her eyes lingered on William a moment longer. "Well, if you need anything, let me know," she said, her voice kind but firm. "You've got my number, Ella." Ella nodded quickly. "Thank you, Mrs. Johnson." Once the door closed, the atmosphere inside shifted again. Margaret leaned back against her pillows, her weariness evident. "You must have questions," she said, her words directed at both Ella and William, "and I'll answer them. But first, I need to rest." William stood reluctantly, his towering frame casting a long shadow over the modest room. "I'll come back tomorrow," he said, his tone gentle. "If that's all right." Margaret nodded, her eyelids already fluttering shut. Ella hesitated, glancing between them. "I'll walk you out," she offered quietly. The hallway outside was dimly lit, the flickering bulb casting uneven shadows on the cracked walls. William walked in silence beside Ella, his hands buried deep in the pockets of his coat. When they reached the front door, he paused, turning to face her. "Thank you for letting me in tonight," he said, his voice sincere. "I know this can't be easy for you." Ella studied him, her young face etched with doubt. "Why do you care so much?" she asked, her words blunt but not unkind. "You don't even know us." William's expression softened. "Because sometimes life gives us second chances," he said, "and I can't ignore this one." Ella didn't respond immediately. She simply nodded, her gaze steady. "Good night," she said finally, opening the door to let him out. William stepped into the cold night air, the city's noise enveloping him once more. As he walked away, his thoughts were heavy with the realization of all he had lost, and the slim hope that perhaps through Ella and Margaret he could begin to make amends. Inside the apartment, Ella returned to her grandmother's side, watching the gentle rise and fall of her chest. Questions swirled in her mind, too many to ask at once. But for now, she simply sat beside Margaret, holding her hand as the threads of their past and present wove together in ways she was only beginning to understand. Morning sunlight filtered through the thin curtains of Margaret and Ella's modest apartment, casting soft patterns across the room. Margaret stirred in her bed, her face pale and drawn. Ella was already awake, bustling quietly in the small kitchen area. She moved with the precision of someone who had long grown accustomed to bearing the responsibilities of a much older soul. Margaret opened her eyes slowly, her voice barely above a whisper. "Ella, sweetheart, come here." Ella set down the chipped mug she had been holding and approached her grandmother's side. "How are you feeling, Grandma? Did you sleep okay?" Margaret smiled faintly, her lips trembling with effort. "Better, thanks to you. But there's something we need to talk about." Ella tilted her head, concern flickering across her face. "Is it about him? That man from last night?" Margaret nodded, her frail hands fidgeting with the edge of her blanket. "His name is William Ashford. We were very close a long time ago, before your father was born." Ella's eyes widened, her mind racing to fill in the gaps. "Why haven't you ever talked about him before?" Margaret sighed, her voice tinged with both regret and weariness. "It wasn't a story I thought I'd ever need to tell. We were young and in love, but life had other plans. His ambition, my stubbornness, it all came between us. I never imagined he'd walk back into my life, especially not now." Ella hesitated, her youthful face etched with curiosity. "Do you trust him, Grandma? He seems kind, but—" "I don't know." Margaret met her granddaughter's gaze, her eyes glassy with emotion. "I don't know if I trust him, Ella, but I do know that people can change, even after many years." Before Ella could reply, a soft knock at the door interrupted them. She moved quickly to answer it, her small frame tensed with caution. When she opened the door, William stood there, holding a paper bag that emitted the faint aroma of fresh pastries. "Good morning," he said gently, his gaze shifting past Ella to where Margaret lay. "I brought something for breakfast. I hope that's all right." Ella stepped aside reluctantly, motioning for him to enter. "She's awake," she said simply. William nodded and crossed the room, his every movement careful, as though afraid to disturb the fragile peace of the space. He set the bag down on the small table and turned to Margaret, offering her a soft smile. "How are you feeling today?" Margaret's expression was guarded, though not unkind. "Better than last night," she replied, her voice quiet. "I wasn't sure if you'd come back." "I meant what I said," William responded. "I'm here to help, if you'll let me." Margaret looked at him for a long moment, her gaze searching his face for traces of the man she had once known. "Help can come with a price, William. What is it you're really here for?" Her words hung in the air, heavy with implication. Ella watched the exchange, her young eyes flickering between them. William exhaled slowly, his shoulders sagging slightly. "I don't want anything from you, Margaret," he said, his voice earnest. "I only want to make amends for the past. When I saw Ella on the street, heard her sing your song. It was like fate brought me back to you." Margaret's expression softened, though skepticism lingered in her gaze. "And what happens when your guilt fades? Will you disappear again?" The question struck William like a blow. He lowered his head, unable to meet her eyes. "I don't blame you for doubting me," he admitted, "but I'm not the same man I was. I've spent most of my life chasing wealth and power, thinking it would make me happy. It didn't. And now, seeing you, seeing Ella, I realize how much I've lost." Margaret sighed, her hand brushing weakly against the blanket. "Life doesn't give us do-overs, William, but maybe it does give us second chances." William's gaze lifted, meeting hers with quiet determination. "Then let me prove to you that I've changed. Let me be here for both of you." Before Margaret could respond, a fit of coughing overtook her, her frail body shuddering with each heave. Ella rushed to her side, helping her sit upright and patting her back gently. William stepped forward, his expression stricken. "Is there a doctor we can call?" he asked urgently. Margaret shook her head weakly, her voice rasping as she caught her breath. "This is my reality now, William. I have medication to manage it, thanks to Ella." William's jaw tightened, his frustration evident. It shouldn't be just her responsibility. "She's a child. She's more capable than most adults I've known," Margaret replied, her voice laced with pride. "But I won't argue with you. If you want to help, then do it without expectations." William nodded solemnly. "I will." Ella watched the exchange, her young face thoughtful. Despite her lingering doubts, a small part of her wanted to believe that William's intentions were genuine. For now, she would wait and see. As the morning wore on, the three of them shared a quiet meal together, the warmth of fresh pastries momentarily easing the chill of the apartment. Though the tension between Margaret and William remained, it was softened by something unspoken, a tentative hope that their fractured past might yet be mended. The winter wind howled outside as the dim light in Margaret's apartment flickered. Despite the coziness of the morning meal they had shared, a tension lingered in the air like a fragile thread stretched too thin. William sat by the small table, his hands resting uneasily on his knees, watching Margaret recline against her pillows. Ella, busy folding a blanket, moved with the practiced efficiency of someone who had been the caretaker for far too long. As the morning passed, a soft knock on the door disrupted the quiet. Ella glanced at Margaret, who nodded faintly, before going to answer it. She opened the door to find a man standing there, his broad shoulders slightly hunched from the cold. He looked to be in his late 40s, with salt and pepper hair and kind, weathered eyes. In his hand, he carried a small, leather-bound journal. "Good morning," the man said, his voice gentle but firm. "I'm Dr. Jacob Allen." Margaret and I go back a long way. He smiled at Ella, though his face carried a hint of worry. I've come to check on her. Ella hesitated, unsure, until Margaret called from within. Let him in, Ella. Jacob's an old friend. Reluctantly, Ella stepped aside to let the doctor in. He removed his scarf and gloves, nodding briefly at William as he approached Margaret's bed. Margaret, Jacob said warmly, pulling a chair closer. You look as stubborn as ever, though I doubt that reflects how you're feeling. Margaret chuckled weakly, her hand reaching out for his. You know me too well, Jacob. I'll out-stubborn this illness if I can. Ella moved quietly to the corner of the room, her sharp eyes taking in the way the doctor glanced at William. There was no hostility, only curiosity. It was clear Jacob was trying to piece together the dynamic of this unexpected visitor. Who's this? Jacob asked, his tone light but probing. William Ashford, Margaret said, her voice carrying a weight that made Jacob's eyes widen slightly. We go back even further than you and I do. The doctor nodded, understanding unspoken between the two adults. He returned his attention to Margaret, his tone softening. Margaret, I need to know the truth. How are you managing? And don't spare my feelings. Margaret hesitated, glancing at Ella. We're getting by, she said carefully. Ella's been extraordinary. She keeps me alive. Jacob frowned, concern etched deep into his face. It's not her job to carry all of this, Margaret. She's just a child. William shifted uncomfortably, the same thought echoing in his mind. He cleared his throat, drawing Jacob's attention. That's why I'm here, William said, his voice steady. I want to help. Jacob raised an eyebrow, studying him. Help how? William hesitated, unsure how to explain the complex emotions and guilt that had driven him here. Financially, for starters, he said finally, but also to make up for lost time. Margaret's expression softened slightly, but her voice remained firm. Jacob, you've known me long enough to know I don't accept charity. This isn't charity, William interjected. It's an overdue responsibility. The room grew silent, the only sound the ticking of a small clock on the wall. Jacob broke the tension by pulling a stethoscope from his bag. Well, he said briskly, let me do what I came here to do. He gestured for Ella to come closer. Why don't you help me, Ella? I'll need an assistant. Ella's face lit up with a small smile. She moved to Jacob's side, eager to be of use. He handed her the stethoscope, guiding her small hands as he placed it against Margaret's chest. Listen carefully, he said, his voice low. Tell me what you hear. Ella tilted her head, concentrating. It's slow, she said hesitantly. Jacob nodded. Good ears? That's her heart. It's doing its best, but it's tired. As they continued, William watched quietly, his thoughts racing. Seeing Ella's excitement in helping the doctor stirred something in him, a mixture of pride and sorrow. She was so young, yet carried herself with a maturity that shouldn't have been necessary. He resolved silently to ensure she wouldn't have to bear such burdens alone much longer. When Jacob finished, he turned back to Margaret, his expression serious. You need rest, Margaret. Proper rest. And you need better support than this medication alone. Margaret's lips pressed into a thin line, her pride making her bristle. I'm doing the best I can. Jacob's gaze softened, but his tone was firm. It's not enough, and you know it. William stood then, his voice steady. Then I'll make sure she has what she needs. Jacob looked at him again, his eyes narrowing slightly. And how long do you plan to stay involved, Mr. Ashford? As long as they'll let me, William replied, meeting the doctor's gaze without flinching. The tension in the room eased slightly as Jacob nodded, seemingly satisfied with the answer. He packed his bag and stood, placing a reassuring hand on Ella's shoulder. You're doing a wonderful job, Ella, he said gently. But remember, you don't have to do it all alone. Ella smiled faintly, her gaze flicking toward William. "Maybe not anymore," she murmured. Jacob left shortly after, his visit leaving behind a sense of both hope and urgency. As the door clicked shut, the three of them sat in the quiet, each grappling with the unspoken weight of what lay ahead. William glanced at Ella, a determination solidifying in his heart. He was beginning to see not only the past he had lost, but also the future he might help shape. The days passed in a tentative rhythm, the fragile balance between the past and present held together by shared meals, quiet conversations, and the unspoken effort to heal old wounds. William became a steady presence in the small apartment, often bringing groceries or sitting by Margaret's side as she rested. His relationship with Ella grew cautiously, each interaction a small step toward trust. Yet beneath the surface, doubts lingered, especially for Ella, who had lived too much life to fully believe in the permanence of anyone's good intentions. One crisp afternoon, William returned with a small bag of fresh fruit and a hardcover book he thought Margaret might enjoy. As he stepped inside, he noticed Ella sitting near the window, her small frame silhouetted against the pale winter light. She was quiet, her gaze fixed on the street below. "Something on your mind?" William asked. Setting the bag on the counter, Ella hesitated, then shook her head. "It's nothing," she replied, though her tone suggested otherwise. He didn't press her, instead unpacking the groceries in silence. Margaret, propped up against her pillows, watched them both with a mixture of gratitude and apprehension. Though she had come to appreciate William's help, the years apart had left scars that couldn't be mended overnight. Later that evening, as the apartment settled into its usual stillness, Ella sat by Margaret's side, holding her hand. "Grandma," she said quietly, "do you think he's really going to stay?" Margaret opened her eyes, her face softening at the sight of her granddaughter's earnest expression. "I think he's trying," she replied, "but trying doesn't erase the past, Ella. It just gives us a chance to build something new." Ella nodded, though the weight of uncertainty still hung heavily on her young shoulders. She didn't entirely understand the history between her grandmother and William, but she knew enough to sense how much pain it had caused. She wanted to believe in the man who now seemed so determined to help them, but trust didn't come easily to her. Not after all they had endured. The following morning, William arrived earlier than usual, his expression more serious than Ella had seen before. He carried a thick envelope under his arm, which he set carefully on the table before addressing Margaret. "I've been thinking about what Jacob said," he began, his voice steady. "You need more than medication to get through this, and Ella deserves to be a child, not a caretaker." Margaret frowned, her pride bristling at his words. "I've done fine on my own," she said, though her voice lacked conviction. "You shouldn't have to," William countered gently. "Let me take some of the burden. I've spoken with a home care agency. They can send someone a few days a week to help with your medication, meals, and anything else you need." Margaret's lips pressed into a thin line. "That's not necessary." "It is," William insisted, his tone soft but firm. "This isn't charity, Margaret. It's what anyone would do for someone they care about." Ella, who had been listening quietly from her corner of the room, finally spoke. "Can we afford that?" she asked, her voice cautious. William turned to her, his gaze steady. "Yes, I'll take care of everything." Margaret sighed, her resistance beginning to waver. "And what about you, William? What happens when you leave again? What happens to us then?" The question hung in the air, stark and unyielding. William's face hardened, not with anger but with the weight of his own guilt. "I'm not going anywhere," he said, the conviction in his voice surprising even himself. "I've already lost too much. I won't make the same mistake again." Margaret studied him for a long moment, her expression unreadable. Finally, she nodded, though her acceptance came with a note of caution. "All right," she said quietly. "But if you're staying, you need to prove it, not just to me, but to Ella." Ella glanced at her grandmother, then at William. "How do you prove something like that?" she asked, her voice tinged with both curiosity and doubt. "You let time do the talking," Margaret replied, a faint smile softening her features. The days that followed were filled with small, quiet gestures of change. A nurse began visiting the apartment, easing some of Ella's responsibilities. William spent more time with her, encouraging her to focus on school and even bringing her small notebooks and pencils for drawing. Margaret watched these moments unfold with a mixture of hope and guarded optimism, her heart torn between wanting to trust William and fearing the pain of losing him again. One evening, as Ella sat at the table sketching a scene from their neighborhood, she looked up at William and asked, "Why didn't you come back before now?" The question caught him off guard, but he didn't look away. "I was afraid," he admitted. "Afraid of facing the mistakes I made, afraid of not being forgiven." Ella considered his words carefully, her pencil pausing mid-stroke. "Grandma says people deserve second chances," she said finally. "But they have to earn them." William nodded, her words resonating deeply. "She's right," he said, "and I'll spend the rest of my life trying to earn mine." Ella didn't reply, but the faintest hint of a smile touched her lips. For the first time, she began to think that maybe, just maybe, William's presence in their lives could be more than a fleeting chapter. The snow had begun to melt, leaving patches of damp pavement exposed beneath the slush. The small apartment seemed brighter with the addition of fresh flowers William had brought earlier that morning, their delicate fragrance a subtle reminder of life's beauty amidst the struggles. Margaret rested in her bed, her face serene but visibly tired, while Ella sat by the window sketching quietly. William, seated across the room, sifted through a stack of papers. They were legal documents and medical forms, all related to the home care services he had arranged for Margaret. The steady rhythm of Ella's pencil scratching against paper filled the room, a soothing counterpoint to the tension simmering beneath the surface. "Ella," Margaret said softly, breaking the silence, "would you bring me a glass of water, darling?" Ella nodded, setting down her sketchbook and heading to the kitchen. William took the opportunity to approach Margaret, his voice low and measured. "How are you feeling today?" Margaret gave him a tired smile. "As well as can be expected. The nurse has been a blessing. Thank you for that." William nodded, his expression thoughtful. "It's the least I can do." Margaret's smile faded slightly as she studied his face. "You're carrying something heavy today. What is it?" William hesitated, the weight of her question settling on him. "I've been thinking about what you said," he admitted, "about earning a second chance." "And," Margaret prompted, her tone gentle but firm. "And I don't know if I'm capable of it," William confessed. "I've spent so long focused on myself, on my success. I'm not sure how to undo all of that." Margaret reached out, her frail hand resting on his. "It's not about undoing the past, William. It's about what you do from this moment forward." Their conversation was interrupted by Ella, returning with a glass of water. She handed it to Margaret, her sharp eyes flicking between the two adults. "What were you talking about?" she asked, her tone curious but guarded. "Life," Margaret said simply, taking a sip from the glass, "and how it's never too late to change it." Ella tilted her head, considering her grandmother's words. "But what if people don't believe you've changed?" she asked, glancing at William. "You show them," Margaret replied, her gaze steady. "Not with words, but with actions." The truth of Margaret's statement hung in the air, and William felt its weight. He looked at Ella, her small frame brimming with questions she was too young to carry. "She's right," he said quietly. "I need to show you, both of you, that I'm here to stay." Ella didn't respond immediately. She simply returned to her spot by the window, her pencil resuming its quiet rhythm against the paper. Later that evening, as the light outside began to fade, William received a phone call. He stepped into the hallway to answer, his voice low. Ella, curious, listened intently as snippets of his conversation drifted through the partially closed door. "I understand the urgency," William said, his tone clipped, "but I need more time." "No, I can't leave yet." "This is important," Ella frowned, the words fueling her lingering doubts. She returned to her drawing, trying to push the thoughts aside. When William re-entered the apartment, his expression was tense but composed. Margaret looked up from her book, sensing the shift in his demeanor. "Everything all right?" she asked. William hesitated, then nodded. "Just business," he said, though his voice lacked conviction. Margaret didn't press him, but her eyes lingered on his face, as if searching for the truth he wasn't sharing. That night, as Margaret slept and the apartment grew quiet, Ella approached William, who was seated by the small table, lost in thought. She stood beside him, her presence tentative but insistent. "Are you going to leave?" she asked bluntly. William looked up, startled by her directness. "No," he said firmly. "I'm not going anywhere." "Then why did you say you needed more time on the phone?" Ella pressed, her voice steady despite the vulnerability in her eyes. William sighed, running a hand through his hair. "It's complicated, Ella. There are people who expect things from me, business obligations I can't ignore. But you just said you wouldn't leave," she countered, her tone growing sharper. "So, which is it?" The earnestness in her voice cut through him, and he leaned forward, meeting her gaze. "I'm here," he said. "No matter what happens with my business, you and your grandmother come first." Ella studied him for a long moment, her expression unreadable. Finally, she nodded, though the doubt in her eyes lingered. "I hope you mean that," she said quietly, before turning and retreating to her corner of the room. William watched her go, the weight of her words pressing heavily on his heart. He knew that earning her trust, and Margaret's, would require more than promises. It would take time, sacrifice, and unwavering commitment, things he hadn't truly offered anyone in years. As the apartment fell into stillness, William resolved to face the challenges ahead, knowing that the road to redemption would not be easy. But for the first time in a long while, he felt a glimmer of purpose, a chance to rebuild not just his relationship with Margaret, but a future where Ella could finally know the security and love she deserved. A brittle calm settled over the apartment in the days that followed. The nurse's regular visits helped ease some of the burden on Ella, giving her moments to sketch or play quietly. But the looming tension in William's expression grew more pronounced. Despite his assurances, both Margaret and Ella sensed that something outside their little world was pressing in on him. One cold morning, Margaret woke earlier than usual. She lay still for a moment, her gaze lingering on the ceiling before turning toward the small table where William sat, reviewing more paperwork. His brow was furrowed, his usually composed demeanor cracking at the edges. "William," Margaret called softly. He glanced up, startled, and set the papers aside. "Good morning," he said, forcing a smile. "How are you feeling?" Margaret didn't answer immediately. Instead, she gestured for him to come closer. When he did, she placed her frail hand over his. "You're distracted," she said bluntly. "What's happening?" William sighed, the weight of her question pressing down on him. He had tried to shield her from the storm brewing in his professional life, but Margaret's perceptiveness left little room for pretense. "My company," he admitted reluctantly. "There are complications. My board is pressuring me to return." Margaret's eyes softened with understanding, though her expression was tinged with concern. "And what happens if you don't?" William hesitated, his jaw tightening. "They'll try to take control," he said finally. "Years of work, everything I built, they could take it all." Margaret studied him, her gaze steady. "And yet, you're still here." William met her eyes, his voice quiet but firm. "Because this matters more." Margaret smiled faintly, though the weariness in her face deepened. "You've changed, William, I see it, but change doesn't come without sacrifice." Their conversation was interrupted by Ella, who shuffled into the room carrying a small notebook. She stopped short when she saw the seriousness in their expressions. "Is everything okay?" she asked cautiously. William straightened, forcing a lighter tone. "Everything's fine," he said. "Just a grown-up conversation." Ella didn't look convinced, but she nodded and handed Margaret the notebook. "I drew this for you," she said softly. Margaret opened the notebook to find a delicate sketch of their apartment, complete with the small vase of flowers William had brought days earlier. "It's beautiful, Ella," Margaret said, her voice tinged with pride. "You have such a gift." Ella smiled shyly before retreating to her corner, but her sharp ears caught the faint murmur of William and Margaret's continued conversation. "You can't hold off forever," Margaret said quietly. "You have a life outside of this." William's response was firm, that life feels meaningless without you two. Later that afternoon, a knock at the door broke the uneasy stillness. Ella answered to find Jacob, the doctor, standing there with his usual calm demeanor. He stepped inside, his presence immediately filling the room with a sense of order. "How's everyone today?" Jacob asked, glancing between Margaret and William. "Managing," Margaret replied, her tone wry. Jacob approached her bed and began his routine examination, asking questions and noting her responses. As he worked, his gaze shifted to William. "You look tired," he observed bluntly. William offered a faint smile. "It's been a busy few weeks." Jacob nodded, but didn't press further. After finishing with Margaret, he turned to William. "May I have a word with you outside?" The two men stepped into the hallway, their voices low. Ella, curious, crept closer to the door, her small frame hidden in the shadows. She strained to hear their conversation. "Her condition is stable for now," Jacob was saying, "but she's fragile. Any significant stress could worsen things." "I understand," William replied, his tone grave. "I'll do whatever it takes to keep her comfortable." Jacob hesitated, then added, "And Ella, she's stronger than she looks, but she's still a child. She needs stability." William nodded, his expression hardening with resolve. "I won't let them down." When the men returned to the apartment, Ella quickly darted back to her seat, pretending to be engrossed in her sketchbook. Jacob packed his bag, offering Margaret a kind smile before leaving. The tension he left behind was palpable. That evening, as the winter light faded and the apartment grew quiet, Margaret called Ella and William to her side. "I need to say something," she began, her voice steady despite her frailty. Both of them leaned closer, their attention fully on her. "You've both given me more than I could ever ask for," Margaret said. "But there's a truth we can't ignore. My time is running out, and when it does, you'll have each other. That's what matters." Ella's eyes filled with tears, but she didn't speak. William reached for Margaret's hand, his own trembling slightly. "Don't talk like that," he said, his voice thick with emotion. Margaret smiled faintly, her gaze shifting between them. "You two are my legacy," she said softly. "Promise me you'll take care of each other." Ella nodded, her small hand slipping into William's. He looked down at her, his heart swelling with a mix of love and determination. "I promise," he said, his voice steady. In that moment, something shifted between them, a fragile yet unbreakable bond forming in the shadow of loss. As the evening deepened, the three of them sat together in the fading light, bound by the unspoken understanding that their lives, though fragile, were now irrevocably intertwined. The days stretched on, quiet but heavy, like the stillness before a storm. William spent most of his time in the small apartment, dividing his attention between paperwork and finding ways to ease the weight on Ella and Margaret. Despite his efforts, there was a sense of inevitability in the air, an unspoken acknowledgement that their fragile peace might not last. One afternoon, as Margaret napped, William suggested they step outside for some air. "You've been cooped up here for too long," he told Ella, offering her a warm scarf he had brought earlier. "A walk will do you good." Ella hesitated, glancing toward her grandmother's room. "What if she wakes up and needs me?" "I'll stay close enough to hear her if she calls," William reassured. "I promise." Reluctantly, Ella agreed. The two of them stepped out into the brisk winter air, the cold biting at their cheeks. The neighborhood was quiet, the muffled sounds of traffic in the distance. William noticed Ella's hesitant steps and decided to break the silence. "You know, when I was your age, I used to walk everywhere. My mother couldn't keep me still for a minute." Ella gave him a sidelong glance, her skepticism evident. "You don't seem like the restless type." William chuckled. "Not anymore. But back then, I was always running somewhere, exploring the woods behind our house, climbing trees, getting into trouble." The faintest hint of a smile tugged at Ella's lips. "What changed?" "Life," William said simply, his tone softening. "Responsibilities, ambition, mistakes." They walked in silence for a while, the rhythm of their steps sinking unconsciously. As they passed a small park, Ella's attention was drawn to a group of children playing. Their laughter echoed through the air, bright and carefree. She watched them intently, her expression unreadable. "You miss this, don't you?" William asked gently. Ella shrugged, her hands tightening around the edges of the scarf. "I don't even know what it's like to just play." Her words hit William harder than he expected. He stopped, kneeling slightly to meet her gaze. "You should," he said firmly. "Every child deserves that." Ella looked away, her voice quiet but steady. "I'm not like other kids. Grandma needs me." "She does," William agreed. "But that doesn't mean you don't deserve to be a kid, too." Ella didn't respond, her gaze fixed on the frosted grass beneath her feet. William let the silence linger, not wanting to push too hard. Instead, he led her to a nearby bench where they sat for a while, watching the world pass by. It was during this quiet moment that an unexpected figure approached them. A woman in her mid-30s, with sharp features softened by a warm smile, stopped a few feet away. "Mr. Ashford?" she asked, tentatively. William looked up, his brows furrowing in recognition. "Claire," he said, rising to his feet. "What are you doing here?" "I've been looking for you," Claire replied, her tone apologetic. "The board is... well, let's just say they're growing impatient." Ella's eyes flicked between the two adults, her curiosity piqued. William's posture stiffened slightly, though his voice remained calm. "I told them I'd handle things in my own time." "And you've been saying that for weeks," Claire countered gently. "You're running out of leverage." William sighed, rubbing the back of his neck. "I can't leave right now." Claire's gaze softened as she noticed Ella, who was watching the exchange intently. "I see," she said, her tone shifting. "Well, if you need more time, you should at least prepare for what might happen if things don't go your way." "I appreciate your concern," William replied, his tone polite but firm. "But my priorities are here." Claire hesitated, then nodded. "All right. But don't wait too long." She offered Ella a kind smile before turning and walking away. As the woman disappeared into the distance, Ella turned to William, her brow furrowed. "Who was that?" "An associate," William said, his tone dismissive. "She works for my company." "Why is she looking for you?" Ella pressed, her sharp intuition cutting through his evasiveness. William hesitated, then sighed. "Because they're worried about the decisions I'm making. But it doesn't matter." "It sounds like it does," Ella said, her voice steady. "You're risking everything for us, aren't you?" William met her gaze, his expression earnest. "You and your grandmother are worth more to me than anything I've built. That's all that matters." Ella studied him for a long moment, her young face etched with emotions she couldn't fully articulate. Finally, she nodded, though her doubt lingered in the corners of her eyes. When they returned to the apartment, Margaret was awake, her expression brightening at the sight of them. "How was the walk?" she asked. "Good," Ella replied simply, slipping out of her coat. William set down the scarf and moved to Margaret's side. "We ran into someone from my business," he admitted, "but it's nothing to worry about." Margaret's sharp eyes narrowed slightly. "You're carrying too much, William." "Don't let it break you." "I won't," he promised, though his voice carried the weight of a man who wasn't entirely certain. As the evening settled in, the fragile peace between them held, though the threads binding their lives together felt increasingly strained. For William, the road ahead was growing more perilous, but in the quiet moments shared with Ella and Margaret, he found the strength to keep walking it, step by uncertain step. The chill in the air carried the faint scent of snow, though the city streets remained bare, a stark grey against the muted winter sky. Inside the small apartment, the tension was palpable. Ella sat at the table, her pencil tracing absent-minded lines in her sketchbook. Margaret reclined in her bed, her frailty more evident as the days passed, though she tried to mask it with small smiles and the occasional quip. William stood by the window, his phone buzzing intermittently on the table behind him. He hadn't answered any of the calls. Ella finally broke the silence. "Why don't you just pick it up?" she asked, her tone sharper than intended. William turned, startled by her directness. "Because it's not important right now." Ella frowned, her pencil pausing mid-stroke. "It seems important if they keep calling." Margaret's voice, though weak, cut through the tension. "Ella, let him be." Ella glanced at her grandmother, frustration flickering in her eyes, but she said nothing more. She returned to her sketchbook, though her lines were more deliberate, almost harsh, as if her emotions had transferred onto the page. William sighed, running a hand through his hair. "I'm sorry," he said, his voice soft. "I didn't mean to make things harder for either of you." Margaret waved a frail hand dismissively. "You're here. That's what matters." But the words did little to ease the weight in the room. William's business obligations loomed over him, a storm he couldn't ignore for much longer. He had received an ultimatum the day before, a formal letter from the board, threatening to strip him of his position if he didn't return to address the growing unrest among the company's investors. The thought of leaving Margaret and Ella, even temporarily, was unbearable. Yet the consequences of inaction were equally dire. That evening, as the light faded and the apartment fell into its usual stillness, there was a knock at the door. Ella went to answer it, her small frame cautious as always. She opened the door to find a man she didn't recognize, a stranger with a sharp suit and a cold demeanor. He carried a briefcase and stood stiffly, as though he belonged to an entirely different world. "Good evening," the man said, his tone clipped. "I'm here to speak with William Ashford." Ella hesitated, glancing back at William, who had already risen from his seat. "It's all right, Ella," he said, stepping forward. "Let him in." The man entered, his presence dominating the small space. He barely acknowledged Margaret or Ella, his focus entirely on William. "Mr. Ashford," he began, his voice low but firm. "I've been sent by the board. They require your immediate attention." William's jaw tightened. I've made my position clear, and they've made theirs clear, the man countered. Your absence is causing instability. If you don't return to resolve this, they'll have no choice but to proceed without you. Margaret, who had been observing silently, spoke up. He's not a machine, she said, her voice sharp despite its weakness. He's a man with priorities beyond your bottom line. The man turned to her, his expression unchanging. And yet, those priorities don't absolve him of his responsibilities. Ella clenched her fists, her young face flushed with anger. He's responsible for us. Ella, William said gently, placing a hand on her shoulder. It's okay. The man's gaze softened slightly, though his tone remained firm. Mr. Ashford, I'll leave you to make your decision, but time is running out. He placed a business card on the table before turning and leaving without another word. The door clicked shut, and the silence that followed was deafening. Ella turned to William, her voice trembling. You're going to leave, aren't you? No, William said immediately, his tone resolute. I'm not leaving. But they're going to take everything from you, Ella pressed, her eyes brimming with tears. You'll lose everything because of us, Margaret interjected, her voice steady despite her exhaustion. Ella, stop. This isn't your burden to carry. Ella shook her head, frustration and fear boiling over. It is my burden. Everything's always my burden. The room fell silent again, the weight of Ella's outburst hanging heavily in the air. Margaret reached for her, her frail hands trembling. Ella, come here. Ella hesitated before moving to her grandmother's side, tears slipping silently down her cheeks. Margaret pulled her close, her voice soft. You don't have to carry this alone, my darling. That's why we have each other. William watched them, his heart breaking at the sight. He approached slowly, kneeling beside Ella. She's right, he said quietly. You don't have to do this alone, and I won't leave, no matter what. Ella wiped her tears, her voice small but steady. Promise. I promise, William said, his voice firm. That night, as the apartment settled into an uneasy quiet, William sat by the window, the business card still on the table beside him. He stared out at the city, his thoughts a chaotic storm of doubt and determination. He didn't know how he would balance the demands of his past life with the fragile hope of his new one. But one thing was certain, he couldn't let Margaret and Ella down. Not now, not ever. The following days unfolded with a tense quiet that hung over the small apartment like a shroud. Margaret's health seemed to waver, her strength slipping with each passing moment despite the nurse's diligent care. William remained steadfast, dividing his time between attending to Margaret, helping Ella, and grappling with the storm of decisions weighing heavily on his shoulders. Ella, though brave, was visibly fraying under the pressure of their uncertain future. It was late in the afternoon when the first hint of betrayal arrived, slipping through the cracks of their fragile sanctuary. William was sorting through a stack of letters that had piled up over the weeks when he came across a sleek envelope embossed with the logo of his company. He paused, dread coiling in his stomach as he opened it. Inside was a formal notice. The board had called an emergency meeting to address his prolonged absence and dereliction of duties. His hands trembled slightly as he read the letter. They were moving to oust him. Margaret, who had been watching him from her bed, spoke softly. "William, what is it?" He looked up, his expression carefully neutral. "Just business," he said, folding the letter and setting it aside. Margaret's sharp eyes didn't miss the tension in his posture. "It's more than that," she pressed. "Tell me." William hesitated, then sighed, sitting down heavily in the chair beside her bed. "The board is making moves to remove me from my position. They've set up a meeting, likely to vote me out." Margaret frowned, concern clouding her features. "Can they do that?" "They can try," William admitted. "And if I don't fight it, they'll likely succeed." Margaret studied him for a moment, her frail hand reaching out to cover his. "Why haven't you gone back to stop them?" "Because I can't leave you and Ella," William replied without hesitation. "Not now." Margaret's grip tightened slightly. "William, you've already given us so much. Don't throw away everything you've built." "I've built a life of hollow achievements," William said quietly. "And I won't abandon you for it." Ella, who had been quietly sketching in the corner, looked up at his words. Her young face was conflicted, her trust in him warring with her fear of the consequences his sacrifice might bring. Later that evening, as the apartment settled into its usual stillness, there was a knock at the door. Ella moved to answer it, her steps hesitant. Standing in the dimly lit hallway was a familiar figure, Claire, William's associate. She looked uneasy, her sharp demeanor softened by something close to regret. "Is William here?" Claire asked gently. Ella nodded, stepping aside to let her in. William appeared from the kitchen, his expression hardening slightly at the sight of her. "Claire," he said, his tone neutral, "I thought we already had this conversation." "I'm not here to pressure you," Claire said quickly, holding up her hands. "But you need to know what's happening. They've brought in an external consultant, someone with the authority to assume control if you don't show up to the meeting." William's jaw clenched, but he said nothing. "You've worked too hard to let this slip away," Claire continued. "And it's not just about you. If they push you out, the company will go in a direction you won't recognize. Everything you built will be unmade." William exhaled sharply, his frustration palpable. "I've made my decision, Claire." "And what about them?" Claire asked, nodding toward Margaret and Ella. "Do they know what you're giving up?" The question struck like a blow. William's eyes flicked to Margaret, who was watching the exchange with quiet intensity. Ella stood frozen near the door, her face pale but her gaze unwavering. "William," Margaret said softly, her voice carrying a strength that belied her frailty. "She's right. We can't let you sacrifice everything for us." William turned to her, his expression desperate. "You're more important than anything I've ever done," he said firmly. "But at what cost?" Margaret asked, her tone gentle but unyielding. "You've spent your life running from regret. Don't let this become another one." The room fell silent, the weight of Margaret's words settling over them. Claire, sensing that her presence was no longer necessary, excused herself with a quiet goodbye, leaving the three of them to face the truth of their shared predicament. Ella approached William hesitantly, her small hand reaching for his. "You don't have to choose, you know," she said quietly. "You can have both." William knelt down, his hands resting on her shoulders. "It's not that simple, Ella." "Maybe it is," she replied, her voice steady despite the tears brimming in her eyes. "Maybe you just have to believe it is." Margaret smiled faintly, her gaze softening as she watched them. "She's wiser than both of us," she murmured. William looked between them, his heart heavy with the weight of their love and his own fear of failing them. The road ahead was murky, filled with impossible choices and uncertain outcomes. But for the first time, he felt a flicker of hope that maybe, just maybe, they could find a way through it together. The dim light of dawn filtered through the frost-covered window as William sat at the small kitchen table, his hands clasped around a steaming mug of coffee. The room was silent except for the faint sounds of Margaret's breathing from her room and the occasional scratch of Ella's pencil as she worked on another sketch. Despite the outward calm, the tension in the apartment was almost tangible, wrapping around them like the chill of the winter morning. William had spent the night staring at the business card Claire had left. The ultimatum it represented burning in his mind. Every logical part of him screamed to return to his company, to fight for the legacy he had built. Yet every time he considered it, the image of Ella and Margaret, two people who had come to mean more to him than he ever thought possible, stopped him cold. Ella looked up from her sketchbook, watching him silently. She had grown used to the furrowed lines on his brow, the way his shoulders seemed perpetually tense. "You're not eating," she said softly, breaking the silence. William glanced at her, startled by her observation. "I'm fine," he replied, though his voice lacked conviction. "No, you're not," Ella said, setting her pencil down. "You're worried." He smiled faintly, the expression not quite reaching his eyes. "You don't miss much, do you?" Ella shook her head, her gaze unwavering. "Grandma says I'm like her. I notice things." Before William could respond, Margaret's voice called faintly from her room. Ella moved quickly, disappearing into the other room to check on her grandmother. William stayed behind, staring down at his mug, as if it held the answers he desperately sought. Moments later, Ella returned, her face clouded with worry. "Grandma wants to talk to you." William stood immediately, his heart pounding as he entered Margaret's room. She looked more frail than ever, her skin pale against the pillow, but her eyes were sharp, filled with determination. "William," she began, her voice weak but steady. "Sit down." He obeyed, pulling a chair closer to her bedside. "What is it, Margaret?" She reached out, her thin fingers brushing his hand. "You've been here every day, putting us first. But I see the cost. You're stretched too thin, and it's only a matter of time before something gives." "You and Ella are my priority," William said firmly, his voice thick with emotion. "Nothing else matters." Margaret shook her head, her lips curving into a faint smile. "That's not true, William. You matter too, and so does the life you've built." "I can't leave you," he said, his voice breaking. "Not now." Margaret squeezed his hand gently, her strength surprising him. "You're not leaving. You're doing what's necessary to take care of us. That's not the same as abandoning us." William looked away, the weight of her words pressing heavily on him. "I'm afraid if I go back, I'll lose everything here." "You won't," Margaret said softly. "Because now you know what's truly important. That's something no board of directors can take from you." Ella, who had been lingering in the doorway, stepped into the room. "She's right," she said quietly. "You always tell me we don't have to do this alone. Maybe that's true for you too." William looked at both of them, his heart swelling with a mix of love and anguish. He knew they were right, but the fear of failing them, of repeating the mistakes of his past, clung to him like a shadow. That evening, after much discussion and encouragement from Margaret and Ella, William made a decision. He would attend the meeting, not to salvage his pride or fortune, but to ensure that his work could continue to support the life he was building with them. As the night wore on, the three of them sat together in the small living room, sharing quiet stories and memories. Margaret's laughter, though faint, filled the room like a balm, easing some of the tension that had lingered for days. Ella leaned against William's side, her small frame warm and steady, and for the first time in weeks, he felt a glimmer of hope. The following morning, William packed a small bag, preparing for the trip to the company's headquarters. Ella watched him carefully, her sharp eyes missing nothing. "You'll come back, right?" she asked, her voice soft but firm. William knelt in front of her, his hands resting on her shoulders. "Of course, I will," he said. "I promise." Margaret, propped up against her pillows, smiled faintly. "We'll be here waiting." As William stepped out into the cold morning air, his breath forming small clouds in the frosty air, he felt an odd sense of clarity. The road ahead would be difficult, filled with challenges he couldn't yet foresee, but for the first time he was walking it with purpose, not for himself, but for the family he had found in the most unexpected of places. The boardroom at Ashford Enterprises was as imposing as William remembered it. The walls were lined with dark wood panels, adorned with framed certificates and photos from the company's many successes. At the center of the room, a long, polished table gleamed under the soft glow of pendant lights. Around it sat the board members, their faces a mixture of impatience and veiled curiosity as they watched William take his seat at the head of the table. He had returned to this world, one he had meticulously built, but the familiarity did little to ease the weight pressing on his chest. His decision to come here hadn't been easy, and the echoes of Margaret and Ella's voices urging him to fight for what mattered lingered in his mind. "Mr. Ashford," began Charles Bennett, the board chairman, a man whose salt and pepper hair and sharp suit exuded authority. "We are pleased you could finally join us. However, your prolonged absence has raised significant concerns." William met Charles's gaze, his expression calm but unyielding. "I'm here to address those concerns," he said, his voice steady. Charles nodded, though his expression remained guarded. "The company has faced considerable instability in recent weeks. Your lack of leadership has left us no choice but to consider appointing someone else to oversee operations." The words hung in the air like a challenge, but William didn't flinch. "I understand your frustrations," he said, leaning forward slightly. "But my absence wasn't without purpose. I've been attending to matters that are deeply personal, matters that have reminded me why I built this company in the first place." A murmur rippled through the boardroom, the members exchanging skeptical glances. Claire, seated near the far end of the table, gave him a subtle nod of encouragement. "What assurance do we have," Charles continued, "that you'll remain fully committed moving forward?" William's jaw tightened, but his voice remained even. "Because I'm more committed than ever. This company isn't just a business to me, it's a legacy, but legacies mean nothing if they're built on empty values." Another murmur followed, this one tinged with intrigue. William took a deep breath, his next words deliberate. "In my time away, I've realized that our success as a company should reflect more than just profits. It should reflect the impact we have on people's lives, our employees, our partners, and the communities we serve." Charles raised an eyebrow, his tone skeptical. "A noble sentiment, but sentiment doesn't pay dividends." "It does when it's done right," William countered. "Investing in our people, in sustainable practices, in long-term growth, that's what builds real value. That's what ensures this company thrives beyond any one person's tenure." The room fell silent, the weight of his words settling over the board. William knew he was walking a fine line, appealing to both their pragmatism and their sense of purpose. He glanced at Claire, who gave him another encouraging nod. "I'm proposing a strategic shift," William continued, "one that balances profitability with responsibility. But I can't lead that shift unless I have your trust." Charles studied him for a long moment, his expression unreadable. "You've made a compelling case, Mr. Ashford," he said finally, "but actions speak louder than words. Are you prepared to prove your commitment?" William nodded. "I am." The meeting continued, the discussion turning to logistics and specifics. By the end of the day, William had successfully secured a tentative agreement to remain as CEO, contingent on his ability to deliver on his promises. The relief he felt was tempered by the knowledge that the road ahead would be arduous. As the board members filed out, Claire approached him. "You handled that well," she said, her voice low. "Thanks to you," William replied. "Your support meant more than you know." Claire smiled faintly. "Just don't make me regret it." William chuckled softly, the tension in his shoulders easing slightly. "I'll do my best." When he returned to the small apartment that evening, he was greeted by the warm glow of the lamp and the sight of Ella curled up with her sketchbook. Margaret looked up from her bed, her face lighting up at the sight of him. "You're back," she said. her voice tinged with both surprise and relief. "I told you I would be," William replied, his smile genuine as he set down his bag. Ella ran to him, her small arms wrapping around his waist. "Did it go okay?" she asked, her voice muffled against his coat. "It went better than I expected," William said, kneeling to meet her gaze. "I couldn't have done it without you and your grandmother." Margaret smiled faintly, her eyes shining with pride. "We never doubted you." As the evening wore on, the three of them sat together, sharing stories and laughter that felt lighter than it had in weeks. For the first time, the weight of the challenges they faced seemed bearable, buoyed by the strength they drew from one another. But deep in William's mind, he knew the fight wasn't over. The board's trust was tentative, the stakes higher than ever. Yet, as he looked at Ella and Margaret, he felt a renewed determination. No matter what lay ahead, he would face it with the family he had found, the family that had given his life meaning once more. The days following William's return from the board meeting passed in a delicate balance of hope and urgency. While he managed to retain his position and propose his vision for the company's future, the board's trust was conditional and fragile. Back at the apartment, Margaret's condition continued to decline. The nurse visited more frequently, her quiet efficiency a source of comfort, but also a stark reminder of the fragility of their situation. On a crisp winter morning, William woke early. The faint light of dawn cast a pale glow through the curtains, illuminating the small table where Ella's sketchbook lay open. He glanced toward Margaret's room, where the muffled sounds of her labored breathing drifted through the door. His heart clenched, the weight of his dual responsibilities pressing heavily on him. Ella stirred from her makeshift bed on the couch, rubbing her eyes as she noticed him standing by the window. "You're up early," she said, her voice groggy. "So are you," William replied, forcing a smile. "Couldn't sleep?" Ella shrugged, her small frame seeming even smaller in the oversized sweater she wore. "I guess." William crossed the room and knelt beside her. "Is something on your mind?" She hesitated, then nodded. "Grandma, I'm scared she's getting worse." William reached out, placing a reassuring hand on her shoulder. "We're doing everything we can for her," he said softly, "and we're not alone. The nurse, Dr. Jacob, they're helping." Ella's eyes filled with unshed tears. "But what if it's not enough?" William paused, searching for the right words. "Sometimes," he began carefully, "we can do everything right and still face things that are out of our control. But what matters is that we're here for her, together." Ella nodded slowly, her expression thoughtful. "You won't leave again, will you?" "Never," William said firmly. "I promised you, and I meant it." Later that day, as the nurse tended to Margaret, William stepped into the hallway to take a call from Claire. Her voice was clipped, her words laced with urgency. "William, we've hit a snag. Some of the board members are already questioning your strategy, saying it's too risky." William's jaw tightened. "I anticipated pushback. What's their main concern?" "They're worried about the upfront costs of your proposed changes," Claire explained. "They don't see the long-term value yet." William exhaled sharply, pacing the length of the hallway. "We need to show them data, examples of companies that have succeeded with similar strategies. Can you pull that together?" "I'll try," Claire replied, "but they're growing impatient. You'll need to present something concrete at the next meeting." "I will," William said, his tone resolute. "Just buy me some time." As he ended the call, he leaned against the wall, closing his eyes. The dual pressures of his professional and personal life felt insurmountable, yet he knew he couldn't afford to falter. Not now. When he returned to the apartment, the nurse was just leaving. She gave him a brief update before departing, her expression kind but weary. Inside, Margaret lay propped up against her pillows, her face pale but her eyes bright as she watched Ella sketch by her bedside. "You look like a man carrying the weight of the world," Margaret said as William approached. He smiled faintly, sitting in the chair beside her bed. "It feels that way sometimes." Margaret reached out, her frail hand brushing his. "You don't have to carry it alone." "I know," William replied, "but some burdens feel like they belong to me." Margaret's lips curved into a faint smile. "You've always been like that, even when we were young." Their conversation was interrupted by Ella, who held up her latest drawing, a portrait of the three of them, seated together in their small living room. "Do you like it?" she asked, her voice shy. "It's beautiful," Margaret said, her voice filled with pride. William nodded, his throat tight. "You have a real talent, Ella." As the evening wore on, the three of them shared quiet moments together, the weight of their challenges momentarily eclipsed by their bond. Yet, in the back of William's mind, the looming pressures of his professional obligations remained, a shadow he couldn't ignore. That night, as Margaret slept and Ella dozed on the couch, William sat by the window, staring out at the city lights. He thought of the decisions he had made, the sacrifices still to come, and the promise he had made to Ella and Margaret. The road ahead was uncertain, but one thing was clear. He would fight for them with everything he had. The following evening carried a weight that pressed heavily on everyone in the apartment. Margaret had spent the day fading in and out of sleep, her strength dwindling with each passing hour. Ella, who usually maintained her brave composure, now hovered by her grandmother's bedside, her small hands clutching Margaret's frail ones. William paced the room silently, his phone vibrating with persistent calls from Claire and the board members. Each buzz was a reminder of the impending decisions he had to face. The nurse arrived later than usual, her calm demeanor offering a brief moment of reassurance. She checked Margaret's vitals, her face remaining professionally neutral but betraying a flicker of concern. William caught her expression and stepped into the hallway with her as Ella stayed by Margaret's side. "How is she?" he asked, his voice low. The nurse hesitated, then met his gaze. "She's stable for now, but her body is very weak. If her condition worsens, it may be difficult for her to recover." William swallowed hard, nodding as he processed her words. "Is there anything else we can do? Just keep her comfortable," the nurse said gently, "and stay close." He thanked her, watching as she gathered her things and left for the night. When he returned to the room, Ella was sitting cross-legged on the floor, her head resting against Margaret's bed. The sight of her, so small and so determined, pierced his heart. "Ella," William said softly, motioning for her to join him on the couch. She hesitated, glancing at Margaret, who was now dozing peacefully, before standing and walking over to him. "You're worried," Ella said bluntly as she sat beside him. William nodded, his shoulders sagging slightly. "I am," he admitted, "but I'm also proud of how strong you've been." Ella's eyes welled up, but she quickly blinked back the tears. "I don't want to be strong. I just want her to get better." William reached out, wrapping an arm around her shoulders. "I know," he said softly. "I do too." The quiet moment was interrupted by another vibration from his phone. Ella glanced at it, her expression clouding. "You should answer it," she said. "It can wait," William replied, silencing the call. Ella frowned, pulling away slightly to look at him. What if it can't? Her words struck him harder than he expected. He knew she wasn't just talking about the phone call. She was talking about everything. Margaret, his company, the precarious balance he was trying to maintain. He exhaled deeply, running a hand through his hair. "I'm trying to figure out how to do the right thing," he said finally. "For all of us." Ella nodded, her expression softening. "Grandma always says the right thing isn't always the easy thing." "She's right," William murmured, his voice heavy with emotion. The hours crept by, the apartment bathed in the dim glow of a single lamp. Margaret stirred occasionally, her voice faint as she asked for water or reassured Ella that she was fine. William remained close, watching over both of them, his thoughts a swirling storm of fear, love, and uncertainty. Just past midnight, Margaret's breathing became shallow, her chest rising and falling with visible effort. Ella, who had fallen asleep against William's side, woke with a start as Margaret called out softly, "William, Ella." Margaret's voice was barely above a whisper, but it carried a strength that belied her condition. They both rushed to her side, William gently supporting Margaret as she struggled to sit up. Her eyes, though weary, shone with clarity as she looked at them. "I need to say this," Margaret began, her tone firm despite her weakened state. "I love you both, more than I can put into words, and I need you to promise me something." William's throat tightened. "Anything," he said. Margaret's gaze shifted between them, her eyes lingering on Ella. "Promise me you'll take care of each other," she said, "no matter what." Ella nodded quickly, tears streaming down her face. "I promise, Grandma." William's voice broke as he spoke. "I promise too." A faint smile touched Margaret's lips, and she leaned back against the pillows, her breathing still labored, but her expression peaceful. That's all I needed to hear. The weight of her words settled over them like a final gift, a reminder of the bond they had forged and the responsibilities they now carried. As the night deepened, William held Ella close, the two of them watching over Margaret with a shared determination to honor her wish. In those quiet hours, William made a silent vow. He would fight for his company, for the future it could provide, but more importantly, he would fight for the family he had rediscovered, a family worth every sacrifice. The early morning light filtered weakly through the apartment windows, casting soft shadows on the walls. The apartment was unusually quiet, its usual rhythm slowed to an almost unbearable stillness. Margaret's frail body lay motionless against the pillows, her breathing faint and uneven. Ella sat beside her, her small hands clutching Margaret's limp ones, while William stood at the window, his silhouette outlined by the pale winter sun. The nurse had arrived just an hour earlier, her calm demeanor a thin veil over the gravity of the situation. She had said little, her presence a quiet reassurance that they were not entirely alone in this moment. But even her gentle movements couldn't mask the truth that hung heavily in the air. Margaret was slipping away. Ella's voice broke the silence, soft and trembling. "Grandma," she whispered, leaning closer. Margaret's eyelids fluttered open, her gaze unfocused but warm as it settled on Ella. "I'm here, sweetheart," she murmured, her voice barely audible. Ella's tears spilled over, her chin trembling as she tried to speak. "I don't want you to go." Margaret smiled faintly, her hand twitching slightly as if to squeeze Ella's. "I'll always be with you, my darling," she whispered, "in your heart." William turned from the window, his face lined with anguish as he moved to Margaret's side. He knelt beside the bed, taking her other hand in his. "Margaret," he began, his voice thick with emotion, "you've always been the strongest person I've known." Her lips curved into a faint smile. "You give me too much credit, William." "No," he said firmly, his voice trembling. "You've held this family together in ways I could never have imagined. I don't know how to do this without you." Margaret's gaze softened, her eyes glistening with unshed tears. "You'll find a way," she said, "because you have to, for Ella." The little girl looked up at William, her face streaked with tears. "We can do it together, right?" she asked, her voice small but determined. William nodded, his hand tightening around Margaret's. "Together." A few moments later, Margaret's breath caught, her body trembling as a sudden wave of weakness overtook her. The nurse stepped forward, her expression calm but serious as she adjusted Margaret's pillows and whispered soothing words. Ella clung to her grandmother's hand, her sobs quiet but heart-wrenching. Margaret opened her eyes again, her gaze fixed on William. "Promise me," she said, her voice barely audible. "Promise me you'll give her the life she deserves." William swallowed hard, his eyes burning with tears. "I promise," he said, his voice steady despite the pain. Margaret's eyes drifted to Ella, her expression softening. "And you," she whispered, her tone filled with love. "Promise me you'll keep singing. You have a gift, Ella. Don't hide it." Ella nodded, her tears falling freely now. "I promise, Grandma." Margaret smiled faintly, her gaze flickering between them one last time. "Good," she murmured. "That's all I needed to hear." Her breathing slowed, each inhale weaker than the last. The nurse placed a gentle hand on William's shoulder, a silent acknowledgement of what was happening. Ella buried her face against Margaret's arm, her sobs muffled but unrelenting. William held Margaret's hand tightly, his head bowed as he whispered a quiet prayer. And then, as the light outside grew brighter, Margaret exhaled one final breath. The room fell into a heavy silence, the weight of her absence settling over them like a thick, suffocating fog. Ella cried openly now, her small body shaking with the force of her grief. William gathered her into his arms, holding her tightly as his own tears fell freely. The nurse quietly packed her bag, her movements respectful and unobtrusive as she prepared to leave them in their mourning. "I'm so sorry for your loss," she said softly, her voice kind and steady. "She was a remarkable woman." William nodded, unable to speak as he clung to Ella, his heart shattered by the magnitude of what they had lost. The hours that followed passed in a blur. Calls were made, arrangements discussed, and condolences offered by neighbors who stopped by with casseroles and flowers. William accepted their kind words with quiet gratitude, though his mind remained focused on Ella, who had retreated to her room with her sketchbook. As the evening settled in, William knocked softly on her door before entering. Ella sat on her bed, her knees pulled to her chest and her sketchbook resting against them. She looked up at him, her eyes red and swollen. "Can I sit with you?" he asked gently. She nodded, and he lowered himself onto the bed beside her. For a while, they sat in silence, the weight of their grief shared but unspoken. Finally, Ella broke the silence. "I don't know how to draw her," she said quietly, her voice trembling. "Nothing feels good enough." William placed a hand on her shoulder, his touch gentle. "You don't have to draw her, Ella," he said. "She's already in everything you create." Ella sniffled, her tears starting again as she leaned against him. "I miss her so much." "I do too," William said, his voice breaking. "But she's still with us, Ella, in the promises we made and the love she gave us." They sat together for a long time, the silence between them no longer heavy but comforting. In that moment, William knew that Margaret's wish had become his purpose. Together, he and Ella would carry her legacy forward, building a life that honored the strength and love she had given them. The funeral was held 3 days later, on a cold but clear winter afternoon. The sky stretched endlessly above, a pale blue canvas streaked with thin white clouds. Margaret's service was simple and intimate, held in a small chapel with just a handful of attendees. Neighbors, the nurse and a few of Margaret's former students had come to pay their respects, their presence a quiet testament to the life she had touched. Ella sat beside William in the front pew, her small hand gripping his tightly. She wore a black dress and a wool coat that seemed too large for her, emphasizing how small she truly was. Her eyes, red from days of crying, remained fixed on the wooden casket at the front of the chapel. William rested a comforting hand on her shoulder, though his own grief weighed heavily on him. The pastor spoke gently, recounting Margaret's life with reverence. He spoke of her as a beloved teacher, a devoted grandmother, and a woman who had faced life's challenges with grace and resilience. William felt each word like a thread stitching together the fragments of his memories with her, the arguments, the laughter, and the quiet moments of understanding that had defined their bond. When the pastor invited anyone to speak, Ella surprised everyone by standing. Her small figure walked slowly to the podium, her steps tentative but purposeful. William watched her with a mix of pride and heartbreak, his breath catching as she adjusted the microphone. "My grandma," Ella began, her voice trembling but clear, "was the most amazing person I've ever known. She taught me how to find beauty in the world, even when things were hard. She believed in me when no one else did, and she always made me feel like I could do anything." She paused, her hands gripping the edges of the podium tightly. "She used to say that even in the darkest times, there's always light if you look for it. I didn't understand what she meant before, but now I do. She was my light, and I'll keep carrying her love with me." Her voice cracked on the last word, and tears streamed down her cheeks. The room was silent except for the sound of muffled sobs from a few attendees. William rose and approached her, placing a steady hand on her shoulder. Ella looked up at him, her tear-streaked face searching for reassurance. He nodded, his own tears falling as he guided her back to the pew. After the service, they made their way to the cemetery, where Margaret was laid to rest under the shade of a bare oak tree. The cold air bit at their cheeks as they stood together, watching the casket lowered into the ground. Ella clung to William's side, her small frame shivering despite her coat. As the last shovelful of earth was placed over the grave, Ella knelt and placed a single flower, a white lily, on the fresh mound of soil. "Goodbye, Grandma," she whispered, her voice barely audible. "I'll make you proud." William knelt beside her, his arm wrapping protectively around her shoulders. "We'll both make her proud," he said, his voice thick with emotion. The walk back to the car was quiet, the crunch of snow under their shoes the only sound. As they drove home, Ella stared out the window, her reflection etched against the frosted glass. William glanced at her occasionally, his heart aching for her and the pain she carried. That evening, the apartment felt emptier than ever. Margaret's absence was a void that seemed to echo in every corner. Ella sat at the table with her sketchbook, though her pencil moved slowly, as if the weight of her grief dulled her creativity. William busied himself with cleaning up, his movements mechanical as he tried to process his own emotions. After some time, he sat across from Ella, watching her draw in silence. "What are you working on?" he asked gently. Ella hesitated before turning the sketchbook toward him. It was a drawing of Margaret, her face radiant and surrounded by soft beams of light. In the corner, Ella had written the words, "Always my light." William's breath hitched as he took in the image. "It's beautiful," he said, his voice barely above a whisper. "She'd love it." Ella nodded, tears filling her eyes. "I miss her so much." "I do too," William said, reaching out to take her hand. "But she's still with us, Ella. In everything we do, in the promises we made." Ella wiped her eyes, her expression softening. "Do you think she'd be proud of us?" William smiled faintly, his heart aching with both loss and love. "I know she would be." As the night deepened, they sat together, their grief no longer isolating but shared. In the quiet of the apartment, a new resolve began to take root in William's heart. He thought of the life he had promised Margaret he would build for Ella, the legacy she had entrusted to him. It wouldn't be easy, but he would honor that promise with every decision he made moving forward. For now, they allowed themselves the space to mourn, the weight of their loss made lighter by the strength they found in each other. The road ahead was uncertain, but they would walk it together, carrying Margaret's light with them every step of the way. The days following the funeral were heavy with an almost suffocating silence. Winter's grip on the city deepened, the streets lined with patches of snow that refused to melt. Inside the small apartment, the absence of Margaret was palpable, her once vibrant presence now replaced by an aching void. William and Ella navigated their grief carefully, each trying to find footing in a world that now seemed unmoored. Ella spent much of her time at the small kitchen table, her sketchbook always open but rarely filled. Her pencil hovered over blank pages, her creative spark dulled by the weight of her emotions. William, too, struggled to focus. His work with the company had resumed, but it often felt hollow compared to the promises he had made to Margaret. One evening, as the city lights cast a faint glow through the frosted windows, Ella finally broke the silence. "Do you think she knew how much we loved her?" she asked, her voice barely above a whisper. William, seated across from her, looked up from the pile of documents he had been pretending to read. "She knew," he said softly. "She always knew." Ella nodded, though tears welled in her eyes. "I wish I could tell her one more time." William reached across the table, taking her hand in his. "We tell her every day by how we live, Ella. She may not be here, but she's still with us in everything we do." Ella looked at him, her eyes searching for reassurance. "Do you really believe that?" "I do," William said firmly, "because I see her in you, your strength, your kindness. And I feel her guiding me, reminding me of what's important." Ella's grip on his hand tightened, her small fingers trembling. "I miss her so much." "I know," William said, his voice thick with emotion. "I miss her too." The following day, William decided it was time for a change. He had spent too long trying to balance his corporate responsibilities with his newfound role as Ella's guardian, and it was clear that something had to give. As he sat at his desk, reviewing yet another report filled with numbers and projections, he felt a surge of clarity. Later that afternoon, he called a meeting with the board. The same imposing conference room where he had fought to retain his position now felt like a relic of a life he no longer recognized. The board members filed in, their expressions a mixture of curiosity and impatience. "Thank you all for coming," William began, his voice steady but firm. "I've spent the last few weeks reflecting on what truly matters, to me, to this company, and to the people we serve." The room fell silent, the air heavy with anticipation. "I've come to a decision," William continued. "Effective immediately, I will be stepping down as CEO of Ashford Enterprises." A ripple of shock passed through the room, followed by a flurry of murmurs. Charles Bennett, the chairman, leaned forward, his brow furrowed. "William, are you sure about this? The company needs your leadership." "The company will thrive," William replied confidently. "I've built a strong foundation, and I trust this team to carry it forward. But my priorities have changed. I made a promise to someone who taught me that success means nothing if it comes at the cost of what truly matters." Claire, seated near the end of the table, gave him a small, understanding nod. As the meeting concluded, William felt a weight lift from his shoulders. For the first time in years, he felt free, not from responsibility, but from the relentless pressure of chasing a legacy that had once consumed him. His legacy, he realized, wasn't in the numbers or the accolades. It was in the relationships he nurtured, the lives he impacted. That evening, William returned to the apartment with a renewed sense of purpose. He found Ella sitting on the couch, flipping through an old photo album Margaret had kept. She looked up as he entered, her expression curious. "How was your day?" she asked. "It was important," William said, sitting beside her. "I made a big decision today." Ella tilted her head, her brow furrowing. "What kind of decision?" "I stepped down from my job," William said simply. Her eyes widened. "You quit?" "I did," he replied, his tone gentle but firm. "Because I want to be here for you, Ella. I want to make sure you have everything you need, not just the basics, but a life filled with opportunities and love." Ella's eyes filled with tears, but this time they were tears of gratitude. She leaned into him, her small arms wrapping around his waist. "Thank you," she whispered. As the evening turned into night, William and Ella began to talk about their future, not in vague terms, but in real, tangible plans. They discussed Ella's dreams of becoming an artist, the kind of school she might attend, and the places they could visit together to inspire her work. For the first time since Margaret's passing, the apartment felt lighter, filled not with the weight of loss, but with the promise of new beginnings. William knew the road ahead would still be challenging, but he also knew they would face it together, carrying Margaret's memory as their guiding light. The cold grip of winter had begun to loosen its hold on the city, giving way to the first hints of spring. The snow that had blanketed the streets for months now melted into small rivulets, carrying away the last remnants of frost. The change outside mirrored the subtle transformations within the apartment. Though Margaret's absence was still deeply felt, the air seemed less heavy, imbued instead with quiet resilience. Ella had taken to spending her mornings by the window, sketching the awakening cityscape. Her pencil danced across the page with a newfound purpose, capturing the faint buds on the trees, the reflections of the sun on melting ice, and the small signs of life emerging from the cold. William often watched her from the kitchen, his heart swelling with pride and hope as he prepared breakfast. One morning, as the scent of coffee filled the air, William placed 2 plates of scrambled eggs and toast on the table. "Come eat, Ella," he called gently. She set her sketchbook aside and joined him, her movements lighter than they had been in weeks. As they ate, William noticed a small smile playing at the corners of her lips. "What's got you in such a good mood?" he asked. Ella shrugged, though her eyes sparkled with quiet excitement. "I was thinking about what Grandma used to say, about looking for the light even when it's hard to see. I think I finally get it." William's expression softened, and he reached across the table to squeeze her hand. "She'd be so proud of you," he said. "I know I am." They ate in comfortable silence, the kind that spoke of shared understanding and unspoken promises. After breakfast, Ella returned to her sketchbook while William settled into the armchair with a cup of coffee. His thoughts drifted to the days ahead and the life he was determined to build for them both. Later that afternoon, they ventured out to the park, something they hadn't done since Margaret's passing. The air was crisp but not biting, and the sun shone weakly through a blanket of thin clouds. Ella carried her sketchbook, her eyes darting around as she searched for inspiration. "Do you remember coming here with Grandma?" Ella asked as they strolled along the path. William nodded, his gaze distant. "I do. She loved it here, the trees, the open space. She said it reminded her of her childhood." Ella smiled faintly. "I think she'd like that we came back." "She would," William agreed, his voice warm, "and I think she'd like what you're doing too." Ella stopped by a bench and sat down, opening her sketchbook to a blank page. William watched as she began to draw, her pencil moving with precision and care. He couldn't see the image she was creating, but the look of focus on her face filled him with quiet awe. As the afternoon wore on, they returned to the apartment. The walk back was quiet but not heavy. There was a sense of peace between them, a shared understanding that they were finding their way forward, step by step. That evening, as they sat together on the couch, Ella pulled out her sketchbook and handed it to William. "I want you to see this," she said, her voice shy but steady. William opened the book to the latest page and felt his breath catch. She had drawn a scene from the park, a tree with budding leaves, a bench bathed in soft sunlight, and 3 figures seated together. It was them, but not just the 2 of them. Margaret was there too, her presence rendered with loving detail. "It's beautiful," William said, his voice thick with emotion. "She'd love it." Ella nodded, her eyes glistening with unshed tears. "I think she's still with us," she said softly. "Not just in our memories, but in the things we do, the choices we make." William placed the sketchbook on the table and pulled Ella into a gentle hug. "She is," he said, his voice steady despite the lump in his throat, "and she always will be." As the night deepened, they talked about the future, about Ella's dreams of pursuing art, about the schools she might attend, and about the adventures they could embark on together. For the first time, those conversations felt less like wishful thinking and more like a real, tangible plan. Before heading to bed, William paused by the small shelf where Margaret's photo sat. He picked it up, his fingers tracing the edges of the frame. "We're going to be okay," he said quietly, his voice a promise to her and to himself. "We'll make you proud." As he set the photo back on the shelf, he felt a sense of calm settle over him. The journey ahead would still be challenging, but he knew they were on the right path. Together, he and Ella would build a future that honored Margaret's legacy, a future filled with love, resilience, and the light she had always believed in. As spring settled over the city, the apartment began to feel less like a place of mourning and more like a home. The days grew longer, sunlight streaming through the windows and casting warm patterns on the walls. William and Ella found a new rhythm, one that allowed space for both their grief and their healing. Ella's mornings were spent at the kitchen table, her sketchbook now brimming with ideas and images. William often joined her, drinking coffee and watching her pencil move deftly across the page. Though she didn't say much during these moments, the quiet concentration on her face told him everything he needed to know. She was beginning to see the world with color and light again. One day, as Ella worked on a new drawing, the phone rang. William answered, his voice cautious. "This is William Ashford." "Mr. Ashford," the voice on the other end began, warm and professional. "This is Catherine Ellis from the Linden Academy of Fine Arts. I'm calling regarding the portfolio you submitted on behalf of Ella." William's heart skipped a beat. Several weeks earlier, he and Ella had sent her drawings to the Academy, a prestigious school known for nurturing young talent. It had been Ella's hesitant idea, encouraged by Margaret's memory and William's unwavering support. "Yes, of course," William replied, his voice steady despite the nervous energy coursing through him. "What can I do for you?" "We were incredibly impressed with Ella's work," Catherine said. "Her use of detail and emotion is well beyond her years. We'd like to offer her a place in our summer art program, fully funded by a scholarship." For a moment, William was speechless. He glanced at Ella, who had paused her drawing to watch him with curious eyes. "That's incredible," he said finally. "Thank you." Catherine explained the details of the program, and as the call ended, William set the phone down, his expression a mix of pride and disbelief. Ella tilted her head, her curiosity mounting. "What was that about?" she asked. William smiled, kneeling in front of her so they were eye level. "That was the Linden Academy of Fine Arts. They loved your drawings, Ella. They've offered you a scholarship to their summer program." Ella's eyes widened, her pencil slipping from her hand. "Really? They want me?" "They do," William said, his voice filled with pride. "Oh, you earned this, Ella." Her face lit up, a rare and genuine smile breaking through her usual guarded expression. She threw her arms around William, her excitement bubbling over. "Thank you for helping me," she whispered. "You did this on your own," William replied, holding her tightly, "but I'm so glad I could be a part of it." The weeks that followed were a flurry of preparation. William helped Ella gather her supplies, filling the small apartment with new sketch pads, pencils, and paints. They visited the academy together for orientation, walking through its grand halls lined with student artwork. Ella's eyes sparkled with awe, her shyness replaced by a quiet determination. As the program began, Ella threw herself into her work, her confidence growing with each passing day. William often picked her up in the evenings, listening as she recounted her classes and the new techniques she was learning. Her excitement was contagious, filling their home with a renewed energy. One evening, after Ella had gone to bed, William sat by the window with a cup of tea. The apartment was quiet, but his thoughts were busy. He looked over at the shelf where Margaret's photo sat, her warm smile frozen in time. He reached for the frame, holding it carefully as he spoke aloud. "She's doing so well, Margaret," he said softly. "You'd be so proud of her. She's everything you always said she'd be. Kind, strong, and so talented." He set the photo back in its place, a small smile tugging at his lips. For the first time in what felt like forever, he felt a sense of peace. The promises he had made to Margaret were no longer burdens. They were the foundation of a new life, one filled with purpose and love. The summer days passed quickly, and soon Ella's art program was drawing to a close. William attended her final showcase, walking into the Academy's gallery with a mixture of pride and anticipation. The room was filled with parents, teachers, and students, each admiring the works on display. William found Ella standing near her piece, her hands clasped nervously in front of her. She had drawn a portrait of their small family, a scene of her, Margaret, and William sitting together in the apartment, the warmth and love between them captured with breathtaking detail. As William approached, Ella looked up at him, her face uncertain. "Do you think she'd like it?" she asked. William studied the drawing, his throat tightening as he took in the care and emotion in every stroke. "She'd love it," he said, his voice thick with emotion, "just like I do." Ella smiled, her confidence growing as other attendees began to admire her work. William stayed by her side, his heart swelling with pride as he watched her receive praise and encouragement. In that moment, he saw the future Margaret had dreamed of, a future filled with light, resilience, and the unbreakable bond of family. The golden hues of early autumn painted the city in a warm glow, the kind that softened edges and made even the harshest corners seem inviting. William and Ella's life had settled into a steady rhythm, one filled with quiet joys and moments of reflection. Their bond, forged through loss and resilience, had grown into something unshakable. One evening, as the first chill of fall crept into the air, William sat at the kitchen table, sorting through a box of Margaret's belongings. It had been sitting in the corner of their living room for months, untouched, as neither he nor Ella had felt ready to confront its contents. But tonight, something drew him to it, a quiet pull he couldn't ignore. Ella sat across from him, sketching as usual, though her eyes flicked to the box with curiosity. "What's in there?" she asked, her voice tentative. William looked up, his expression softening. "It's some of Margaret's things, letters, keepsakes, little pieces of her life." Ella set down her pencil, her curiosity outweighing her hesitance. "Can I help?" "Of course," William said, pushing the box toward her. Together, they began to sift through its contents. There were old photographs, faded with time, showing a younger Margaret with a radiant smile. There were concert programs and sheet music, a testament to her years as a music teacher. And then, near the bottom of the box, they found a bundle of letters tied with a pale blue ribbon. Ella picked them up carefully, her fingers tracing the delicate edges. "What are these?" she asked. William's breath caught as he recognized Margaret's handwriting on the envelopes. "They're letters," he said, his voice thick with emotion. "But I don't know to whom." Ella untied the ribbon and handed the first letter to William. He unfolded it gently, his hands trembling slightly as he began to read. "My dearest William," the letter began, "there are things I've wanted to tell you for so long, things I never had the courage to say aloud." William's eyes widened as he realized the letter was addressed to him. He read on, his voice faltering as he spoke the words aloud for Ella to hear. "I loved you more than I ever thought possible, but life had other plans for us. Even after all these years, I've never stopped thinking of you. I see you in Ella's eyes, in her resilience, in her kindness. She's a reflection of the best parts of you, and I hope you see that too." Tears welled in William's eyes as he finished the letter. Ella sat quietly, her expression a mixture of surprise and understanding. "She wrote these for you," she said softly. William nodded, his throat tight. "She must have written them over the years, but never gave them to me." Together, they read through the rest of the letters. Each one was a window into Margaret's heart, filled with reflections on their shared past, her hopes for Ella's future, and the love she carried for both of them. The letters were a bittersweet gift, bringing both comfort and sorrow as they uncovered the depth of Margaret's emotions. One letter stood out among the rest, written just weeks before her passing. "William," it read, "I've made peace with the life I've lived, but my greatest joy has been seeing you and Ella find each other. Take care of her, nurture her dreams, and know that in doing so, you're fulfilling a promise we made long ago, to always choose love, even when it's hard." When they finished reading, the room was silent except for the faint rustle of leaves outside the window. Ella looked up at William, her eyes glistening. "She really believed in us," she said. "She did," William replied, his voice steady despite the tears on his cheeks. "And we'll honor that belief, Ella, every day." The discovery of the letters brought a sense of closure they hadn't realized they needed. Margaret's words, preserved in ink and paper, became a guiding light for both of them. They placed the letters back in the box, tying the ribbon carefully before setting it on the shelf beside her photo. That night, as William tucked Ella into bed, she looked up at him with a thoughtful expression. "Do you think Grandma knew how much we loved her?" "I think she knew more than we could ever say," William replied, brushing a strand of hair from her face. "And I think she loved us just as much." Ella nodded, a small smile playing at her lips. "Good." As William turned out the light and closed her door, he felt a profound sense of peace. Margaret's letters had given him something he hadn't realized he was searching for, a connection to her even in her absence. A reminder that their love and their promises would carry them forward. In the quiet of the apartment, he sat by the window, looking out at the city bathed in moonlight. He thought of Margaret, her laughter, her strength, and the quiet wisdom she had left behind. He thought of Ella, her resilience and her boundless potential. And for the first time in a long while, he felt that everything was exactly as it should be. The concert hall was alive with energy, its grand interior filled with the soft murmur of an eager audience. Rows of polished seats gleamed under the warm glow of chandeliers, and the air buzzed with quiet anticipation. William sat near the front, his hands resting on his knees as he glanced at the program in his lap. It was a moment he had imagined many times, though the reality of it felt almost surreal. Ella's name was printed neatly under the evening's lineup, listed as the final performance of the night, Ella Ashford, a lullaby for Margaret. The words sent a pang through William's chest, both of pride and a bitter-sweet longing. He glanced at the photograph in his pocket, one of Margaret holding Ella as a baby, her face alight with joy. "This is for you," he whispered. The lights dimmed, and the hum of conversation faded. The evening's performances began, each one a testament to the talent nurtured within the academy. William clapped politely after each piece, though his focus remained fixed on the moment he knew was coming. Finally, the announcer's voice broke through the applause, introducing Ella with a reverence that made William's heart swell. "Our final performance tonight is a special piece, composed and performed by one of our youngest talents. Please welcome Ella Hartwell Ashford." The audience erupted into applause as Ella walked onto the stage. She wore a simple, elegant dress, her small figure dwarfed by the grandeur of the concert hall. Yet as she approached the piano at center stage, her confidence radiated. She paused, bowing slightly to the audience before seating herself at the piano bench. Her hands hovered over the keys for a brief moment, her eyes closing as she took a deep breath. And then the first notes of her lullaby filled the room. The melody was soft and haunting, each note weaving a story that spoke of love, loss, and hope. It was a song that captured Margaret's spirit, her warmth, her strength, and the light she had brought into their lives. William felt tears prick at his eyes as the music swelled, carrying him through memories both joyful and painful. As Ella played, the audience sat enraptured. Her small frame seemed to disappear into the music, her fingers moving effortlessly over the keys as if guided by something greater than herself. Each note resonated deeply, a bridge between the past and the present, between the pain of their loss and the promise of their future. When the final note lingered in the air, there was a moment of profound silence, as though the room itself was holding its breath. Then the applause erupted, a thunderous wave of appreciation that brought Ella to her feet. She bowed again, her face flushed but glowing with a quiet pride. William rose to his feet, clapping so hard his hands ached. He wasn't alone. The entire audience had given Ella a standing ovation. Tears streamed down his face, but he made no effort to hide them. He saw in Ella not just the child she had been, but the young woman she was becoming, resilient, talented, and filled with the love Margaret had poured into her. After the concert, William made his way backstage. He found Ella standing with her instructor, who was lavishing her with praise. When she saw William, she ran to him, throwing her arms around his waist. "You were amazing," William said, his voice thick with emotion. "Absolutely amazing." "Do you think Grandma heard it?" Ella asked, her voice small but hopeful. William knelt down, his hands resting on her shoulders. "I know she did," he said firmly. "And I know she's proud of you, more than words could ever say." Ella smiled, her eyes shining with tears. "I wanted it to be perfect for her." "It was," William assured her. "It was perfect." They left the concert hall together, stepping into the cool night air. The city around them sparkled with lights, a reflection of the stars scattered across the dark sky. Ella clutched the bouquet of flowers she had received, her face radiant with the glow of accomplishment. As they walked home, William thought of Margaret, of the promises they had made to her, and of the journey that had brought them to this moment. He felt her presence with them, not as a shadow of grief, but as a guiding light, a reminder of the love that had bound them together and the strength they had found in each other. Back at the apartment, Ella placed her bouquet on the shelf next to Margaret's photo. She stood for a moment, gazing at the picture with a soft smile. "I did it, Grandma," she whispered. "I hope you're proud." William watched from the doorway, his heart full. He stepped into the room, placing a hand on Ella's shoulder. "She's proud," he said, "and so am I." As the evening wound down, they sat together by the window, sharing stories and laughter. The pain of their loss remained, but it no longer defined them. Instead, it had become a part of the foundation they were building, a foundation of love, resilience, and hope. And as the city lights twinkled outside, William and Ella looked to the future, knowing that Margaret's light would guide them every step of the way. I hope you enjoyed today's story. Subscribe to the channel so you don't miss more stories like this. Leave a like and comment below what you thought of the story. See you in the next video.